Hi, everyone. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologists.com. And I'm super excited to report today because we have Professor Mike Licona of Houston Baptist University, who's an associate professor of theology with us. And joining us also is Joel Rodriguez, who set up this entire meeting, which is really great. And we also have John Dunphy, who's with JMD Apologetics, and he's a biblical studies student. So the four of us are going to chat a little while. We're going to talk a lot about Mike Licona's books. He's written a lot of best-selling books in Christian apologetics, and he's an expert in the field. He's a historian. He knows a lot. And so we're going to let him do almost all of the talking today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joel, because Joel has already prepared a list of questions for Dr. Licona, and we'll move right forward with that.
Hey, great. I'm glad to be here with you all. Well, this will be fun.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello?
I can hear you, Joel. Are you there?
Okay. Dr. Licona?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was just experiencing. So, first of all, tell us about who's Dr. Michael Licona.
Okay, you kind of broke up, but I think you said to say a little about myself. So, well, I'm 57 years old, grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, grew up in a Christian family, became a Christian at the age of 10, went to Liberty University where I was a music major, my intent was to become a professional musician. I played saxophone. But during my time there, I just was growing spiritually and just developed a hunger to know God and to really pursue things. So I got to a point where I was reading, by the time my senior year, I was probably praying an average, well, at least an hour a day, and most days probably closer to 2 hours a day. I know that's strange for a college student, but that's just where I was. And I was reading the Bible at least an hour a day. I just really hungry. So I ended up enrolling in a master's degree in New Testament studies, and wanted to focus on learning Greek, the original language of the New Testament, and was loving it, and ended up just studying, my graduate years studying the New Testament in Greek for hundreds and hundreds of hours. And toward the end of my studies, I began to question whether Christianity was true. It wasn't a matter of anything I'd learned. It was a matter of, how do I know this is true? How do I know this is true? How do I know that I'm not devoting my life to a fairy tale? If I'd been brought up in Afghanistan, I'd probably be a Muslim. In China, an atheist. In India, a Hindu. So how do I think this is true? Why do I think it's true? Is it true? If it's not, eternity could be on the line. So I started to look at the evidence for it, and that led me into things such as Christian apologetics. Later on, I would come back in my late 30s and begin questioning things again, because I recognized that all the study I'd done was really with the intent of verifying what I already believed, rather than seeking truth purely to see where it would lead. I ended up doing something I never thought I would do. I ended up doing doctoral studies, and I wanted to cross every T, dot every I. I was just really obsessed in getting to the bottom line and satisfying my quest for truth. My biggest fear, and still is a fear of mine somewhat today, just not as much as it used to be, was that I know I have biases. And my biggest fear was that my biases would be so influential on me that they would prevent me from discovering truth and following it, and it would cost me eternity. Because we all have biases and we all are guided by them. So, and I knew that that was me too. So that's, that's what I pursued, getting to the bottom line with the resurrection in my doctoral research. And during that time, I engaged in public debates with many of the leading skeptics out there to see how they would respond to what I was, arguing for Jesus's resurrection. And the more I did that and saw their kind of responses, the more I became convinced of the resurrection. So that's a little bit of my story. There's much more, but I could just go on, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's fine. What would you say to some Christians, that would say, well, in my case, I know Christ, I know God exists, I know all of this, I have faith, I know all of the arguments about resurrection, the reliability of the Gospels, and so on. And they would say, well, I don't need to know none of that stuff because I am fine the way the way I am. What would you say to those people who, I'm not going to say that they don't care about evidence. It's not like a, let's say, something big in their lives. Like I'm trying to phrase this question a little bit different in the sense that
I know where you're coming from. So, so I can say, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I can say I was there in my college years. I can remember that I had, even in the early years of my graduate studies, I was there, and I had some roommates who were, I was in New Testament studies. I was just focusing on learning Greek and being able to read the New Testament in Greek, and working on my relationship with the Lord, and growing in Christ. And that's all I cared about. But I had some roommates, two roommates, who were in the Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics program. And they would talk about David Hume and miracles and evidences and all that. And I was where it's like, I don't care about that. I already know Christianity is true. I got a relationship with Christ. I'm growing. I know God. So apologetics had no part in my life. I saw no need for it in my life until I needed it, because I started having doubts. So I can say that it just depends where a person is in their life. It just depends where they're at. We all have different personalities. I'm kind of like Thomas. I need some evidence. And it's not just Thomas, it was all the apostles. They didn't really believe based on the women's testimony. They had to see Christ themselves. So I want evidence. And that's kind of where I was at, and that's where I'm at. So I didn't become a Christian because of the evidence, but I am a Christian today because there is evidence to support the truth of it. So the short answer is, I have no problem with those who say, look, I don't have any need for evidence. I don't care about it. Like I said, I was there. I'm not saying I grew to a higher level or something. It just depends on a person's needs, their personality. I can say that, if you want to be able to relate to some non-believers, you're going to need to be able to present the evidence in an articulate manner. Because they're not just going to take, well, I read the Bible and I got a relationship with the Lord, and all you have to do is pick up the Bible and read it and pray and ask God to show you if it's true, and he will. Start with the Gospel of John. I mean, that's exactly what Mormons say, except they point to the Book of Mormon. So it just depends where you're at, but that's where I'm at, and that's where many of us are.
Yeah, I understand, because in fact, when I went to university, I was telling Stephanie and other people that my professors, they were actually atheists, and we had to read. I remember when we took the class on Pauline literature, I had to read Gerd Luderman, and that was, for me, it was really difficult, all of the stuff he was talking about, because he was actually addressing all of the evidence for the resurrection and responding to every single point. I'm like, oh my God, what is this? And that's when I actually found out about your book, and I learned about Dr. Habermas and William Lane Craig and so on. Yeah, it was really, really helpful for me. That's why I'm asking that question, yeah. So
I think that's I want to say something real quick. I think that's a really good question that you asked, because there are a lot of people, even in this chat right now. So there's a live chat going. In the live chat, we have street epistemologists who basically go out to college campuses sometimes, and they wear little webcams on top of their head. They wear GoPros, and they ask people, "Why do you believe what you believe?" And a lot of people can't articulate a reason that's very convincing. They might just say, just like what Professor Licona said, oh, I just believe because I believe, or I believe the Bible. Why don't you? And someone might say, well, why don't you believe the Vedas, or why don't you believe, a Buddhist text or something like that? And so it is pretty important for people to be able to at least explain besides just relying on pure faith alone, maybe some of the other evidential reasons why they believe.
Yeah, exactly. So something else I want to ask you, a large group of scholars by the name of the Jesus Seminar, and they also had like 100 lay people in there. We're talking about like 150 people, but in there we had a bunch of experts, and they actually came up with a translation of the apocryphal books and the New Testament, and they even classified the words of Jesus. And they would say that a lot of the stuff you find in there, the so-called red letters of Jesus, those sayings were not said by Jesus. What would you say to those people and people who think like that?
Oh, there's a number of things. Well, first of all, the Jesus Seminar isn't much of an entity with influence these days. They were very popular in the in the 1990s and the first couple of years into the new millennium. But hardly anybody consults with them anymore. I had a excuse me, I had a debate with one of their members, one of their prominent members, Stephen Patterson, back in, I think it was 2009. And we had dinner beforehand. And I asked him about those meetings when they all got together and cast the marbles, whether it was red, Jesus actually said it, or pink, Jesus said something very close to this, or, gray, he may have said something like this, or black, he didn't say anything like this. I think
Mm-hmm.
that were the colors. And I said, how many, what was that like, the votes? He said, there was really never anyone there, more than 40 people at a time who voted on these things. And yet these conclusions were put forth as, this is what scholars are saying today. Well, no, this is what maybe 40 scholars or less on the fringe of the theological left were saying. It's not typically, it never was what mainstream scholarship was saying. They were way out there on the left for the most part. Now, there are some of the members who were, fair in terms of, the kind of methodology that they would use. But by and large, they would do things like, they had a naturalistic worldview, metaphysical naturalism. God, if he exists at all, he doesn't perform miracles. We don't see supernatural ever in our world. And so all these things like the miracles of Jesus had to be later constructions of the authors or Christians themselves. They never happened. So when you start off with a worldview like that, of course, you're going to come to certain conclusions, but that's not based on historical investigation. It's based on one's a priori metaphysical assumptions. It's doing philosophy. It's not doing history. And the consequences of that are manifest. Bad philosophy corrupts good history.
Yes, absolutely. So some skeptics, they would say, okay, you guys talk a lot about Jesus and the stuff, you guys have in the Gospels, but there is a problem because we have a lot of pagan myths about gods that were actually killed and they rose from the dead and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So they would say, but wait a minute, and we also have a lot of parallels that we have, in the Jesus story with those stories that came way before Jesus. What would you say to those people who say things like that?
Well, to say that, first of all, I would say that the nearly universal consensus of scholarship today would say that the early Christians did not borrow from these pagan myths. And they give a number of reasons why. So one is that it's implausible. I mean, you think of who these earliest Christians were. They were pious Jews who debated over minutiae of the Jewish law, such as, can Christians eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols? Can Jewish Christians even eat in the same room as Gentile Christians? Did Gentile male Christians need to be circumcised? Did Jewish Christians need to maintain the temple purification rites? Now, if you're going to debate over the minutiae of the Jewish law to this extent, do we really imagine these same Christians engaged in wholesale borrowing from pagan myths to form the foundation of their own? It's extremely unlikely. The second thing I would point out is that the parallels that are figures that are cited are almost always unimpressive. So, for example, the ancient figure who is closest to Jesus is a guy named Asclepius, who was probably entirely fictional. There might have been a core historical character behind it, but Asclepius is back in the I think it's the Homeric epics. So I mean, we're talking like whatever 600, 800 years BC, something like that. So it's a long time. And Asclepius, we really have no evidence that the guy ever existed. He was known as a healer. And I think on one occasion it says he raised someone from the dead, or a couple occasions he raised someone from the dead, but he was basically a healer. That's it. I mean, that's kind of cool, but that's as far as the parallel goes. The closest figure we have that postdates Jesus is a guy named Apollonius of Tyana, who lived in the 1st century, but the first report that we have of him that has survived comes from the life of Apollonius of Tyana, written by Philostratus in the early 3rd century. And what we have is a traveling itinerant teacher who did some miracles. And it said that, well, there's conflicting accounts that Philostratus says. Some said he died, some says he didn't. But there's one account in there that's given of a post-death appearance of Apollonius. And it says that a bunch of Apollonius's followers of Apollonius were together. It doesn't say how long this was after Apollonius's death, or whether these guys were his original followers. It could have been a century later, okay? We just don't know. But they're all in a room together. One is asleep, and he dreams that Apollonius appears to him. And that's the post-death appearance of Apollonius that is described. Now, that's not at all like we find, with Jesus in the Gospels, or as Paul would mention. So, but that's the figure that is given, as a parallel to Jesus. So what you have to do is none of those are impressive enough to form these, say the Christians copied. So you have to take and combine a bunch of these together to form a composite figure. So you take Dionysus, who is Zeus's son, who is said to make wine and create wine, the miracle. And you have Thor, who had his life threatened at birth. And then you have Asclepius, a healer. And then Apollonius of Tyana, who is said to appear in post-death. And then you combine that with Hercules, who is said that after he died, he ascended into heaven. Of course, the story is he got sick. He was a Greek hero, and he got sick. And so he built a big fire, threw himself into it to commit suicide. And he was seen ascending on the horse Pegasus. That's not at all like Jesus's death and ascension. But let's get rid of the dissimilar details, focus only on the similar details from all of these figures spanning more than 1,000 years, and that find a composite figure that looks like Jesus. And that just hasn't convinced scholars, because it would be similar to a historian maybe 1,000 years from now saying, hey, Abraham Lincoln was a tall, lanky Illinois senator who became president and served 2 terms. John F. Kennedy was a president who graduated from Harvard. And there was a character named David Palmer in the popular television series 24 who portrayed the first Black U.S. president. Combine them together, and what do you get? Barack Obama, a tall, lanky Illinois senator who was elected to 2 terms as president. He graduated from Harvard. He was the first Black U.S. president. Therefore, Barack Obama never existed, or some kind of a core person like that existed, but it got embellished over time, so we can't trust any of these things. And see, that's just ludicrous, but that's what these skeptics do in order to say that the Christians copied off of these pagan myths. And so, I mean, I could give you several other reasons, but those are just 2 of them that can give an idea of why a nearly universal consensus of scholarship has rejected the notion that the earliest Christians borrowed from pagan myths. We mainly hear it from non-scholars on the internet. And we have to be careful of that and use discretion, because publishing on the World Wide Web does not make you a world-class scholar.
Yes, exactly. So let me ask you another question, and this is, And we're going to talk a lot about this, but it's just I wanted to touch on this briefly, and that is the question on discrepancies or contradictions. Like in my case, when I learned that that it is a fact that Jesus rose from the dead, for me, if I find contradictions in the Gospels or the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible or anything, it doesn't really matter, because if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, even if we have contradictions. What would you say to those people, those Christians who are concerned about the apparent contradictions that we find in the four Gospels, or discrepancies?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would point out is exactly what you just said. The truth of Christianity is not contingent on an inerrant Bible. It's contingent on whether Jesus rose from the dead. When the apostles were preaching in the book of Acts, and you can see what Paul says in his letters, it was not, it was not, you should believe this because the Bible's inerrant. It's, you should believe this because it's true. Jesus rose from the dead, and we are eyewitnesses of this, they would say. Now, when Paul would speak to the Jews in Acts 17, early in Acts chapter 17, it says it was Paul's custom to go into the synagogues and to demonstrate from the scriptures that the Messiah had to suffer, die, and rise from the dead. So he would go with the divinely inspired scriptures with Jews and argue with them. This is what the scriptures teach, because they all had the scriptures in common. But then when he, later on in Acts 17, when he's in Athens talking to the philosophers there, he never brings up the scriptures. He gives the same message, the death and resurrection of the Son of God, to show that Christianity is true, but he never appeals to the scriptures. He appeals to their own writings to make illustrations. So the fact is, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity was true when he rose from the dead, and that was perhaps decades before the first gospel was written. So
Yes,
if Christianity was true in 2 or 3, 4 decades during that time between the resurrection and when the first gospel was written, there's no way that if there's an error in any of the gospels that it would negate the truth of Christianity, because it was true long before those gospels were ever written. That's the first thing I would point out. So Christianity, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period. Even if there were errors, contradictions in the Bible, whatever. Second thing I would point out is that there are a lot of different ways of explaining these differences. I've written a book on this, came out 2 years ago. Why are there differences in the Gospels? And I talk about in there and I show how at least in 19 different stories in the Gospels that are reported in 2 or more Gospels in which there are differences, that these differences are likely the result of common compositional devices, things that were part and parcel of ancient historical writing, things like transferal, displacement, conflation, compression, literary spotlighting, all these kinds of things that we see commonplace in the ancient literature. If we view the Gospels through the lenses of ancient biography, more than 90% of the differences that we find in the Gospels can be explained quite easily.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about all of that, a little bit later on. But yeah, that's really, a really good answer. I want to ask you now, and you kind of touch on this, but I want to ask you again, what are the Gospels? Like someone who has never read the Bible and is going to read the 4 Gospels. What are the Gospels?
Well, if let's say someone's a new Christian or even an older Christian, just hasn't really looked into this, you say, what do we call something today? There are different genres. There's fiction, there's poetry, there's history, there's biography, whatever you look at. If there's a book written that showcases a person's life, mentions it from birth to death, and talks about the things that they say and did during their lifetime, what do we call that? Well, we call that biography. And so most scholars today, most New Testament scholars, be they liberal, conservative, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, most of them think that the Gospels at minimum, share much in common with the genre of ancient biography. And ancient biography differed somewhat from modern biography. There were some different objectives involved. The literary conventions were somewhat different. There was greater flexibility involved in it. But the short answer is most scholars think that the Gospels share much in common with the genre of ancient biography, if not ancient biography themselves. Most would say Matthew and Mark are ancient biographies. Some would dispute John. Some would say that Luke is historiography rather than biography because it's coupled with Acts. I think that Luke is biography and Acts is historiography. So, but we can at least all agree that they share much in common with ancient biography, and that allows us, if we read it within those lenses, they shed a great deal of light, bring to light a lot of things that we might not see otherwise.
And then how would you compare the Gospels with the other writings of, like Plutarch and the other writings of the first century or that time period?
Yeah, well, I mean, Josephus is historiography, his Antiquities of the Jews and History of the Jews and his Jewish War. That's all history. He's got an autobiography of himself. Other things of that time, you've got Tacitus in early 2nd century. He writes a history of Rome. He writes a biography of his father-in-law, Agricola. You got Suetonius, who wrote biographies of illustrious men, a lot of poets, and then he's got his 12 biographies of the Caesars, the divine Caesars. So Plutarch, he wrote at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. He wrote over 60 biographies. They're called lives. Back then, biography that word didn't come until a few centuries later. But up to that point, biographies were called lives, the life of Caesar, the life of Cicero, things like that. So he wrote over 60 lives, of which 50 have survived. And that's closest, Suetonius's 12 Caesars and Plutarch's lives would be closest in genre to what the Gospels are.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, and this is about the Q source hypothesis, QLMN.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that a lot of evangelical writers are actually adopting that as a framework.
Yep.
As how they do history. I would say not only, and I would say it's the vast majority of historians. That is an accepted fact. But at the same time, I mean, I do have some problems with the Q source hypothesis and so on. But again, what I think is my biggest problem is if Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, then how can we say that we have independent attestation when, I mean, if you believe that Luke and Matthew copied from Mark, that would just make it like one source instead of like multiple sources. Because something we do when we're talking about the resurrection and in my approach, when I take the Gospels, something I point out is, hey, we have independent attestation. But then if we actually embrace the Q source hypothesis, then we don't have independent attestation. So how would you deal with that?
Well, I'd say in terms of Q and independent attestation, I would say, do we have independent attestation still with Mark, Matthew, and Luke? Yes and no. I mean, I lean toward embracing the existence of Q. In fact, in my graduate class that I'm teaching right now at Houston Baptist University, we're going over the synoptic problem this week, and we're discussing the priority of Mark and the two-document hypothesis, which is Q, and the Ferrer hypothesis, which is to say that Mark wrote first and Matthew used Mark as a source and supplemented him, and then Luke used both Mark and Matthew and so forth. So we're talking about all those kinds of things just this week. And it's undeniable that there is some literary dependence that is going on between the Gospels. And the synoptic problem is, it should be called the synoptic puzzle, because it's not really a problem. It's a puzzle. And it's a matter of, well, what is that dependence? So almost all scholars, not all, but a high 90 percentile would say that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as the primary source and supplemented it. What the Q material is if there's something in it that is common to Matthew and Luke, but it's absent from Mark, or that in a few cases you might have Mark say something along those lines, but it is so it doesn't at all necessarily resemble when it's verbal similarities with Matthew and Luke, but yet Matthew and Luke are almost verbatim. Well, then you have to go with one of three options. Either Matthew is using Luke as a source, or Luke is using Matthew as a source, or Matthew and Luke are using a common source, which is no longer extant. And so the Germans had a word for that, for source. It's called Quelle. And so that's just abbreviated as Q. It's like saying X. All right. So it's to say Q is just one of the sources that Matthew and Luke consulted. Could have been oral tradition. Most think it would have been a written document. I think it's entirely possible that what Papias says Matthew wrote originally in Hebrew. He doesn't say it's a gospel. He calls it the Theologia, the sayings, the teachings of Jesus. And it could very well be that that's what Q is. It's what Matthew originally wrote in Hebrew or Aramaic that was later translated into Greek and used as one of Matthew's sources and one of Luke's sources. So that may be all Q is. So in terms of multiple independent sources, if and you're looking at Mark in priority, if Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their source, then in those cases, we can't say that there's multiple attestation. We would look at that, what's called triple tradition, because it's in Matthew, Mark, Luke. We would look at that and say, that's not multiple attestation. If it's in Matthew and Mark, then it's just Mark as the source there. But if you're looking at Mark and Q, like let's say with the temptation in the wilderness by Jesus, you find a lot of verbal similarities and everything between Matthew and Luke. So that would be the Q material. And then you've got Mark, who mentions the temptation in the wilderness, but there's no description in it whatsoever. So either Luke is using Matthew, Matthew is using Luke, or they're both using a common source, which we would call Q. But the temptation in the wilderness would be multiply attested because it's also in Mark. You could also find multiple attestation between Mark and John, because John would be independent of Mark. Even if he knew of the synoptic gospels, he doesn't copy from them. He's an independent source, largely dependent on the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples. You've got some material like the Eucharist sayings in 1 Corinthians 11. You've got other things that are multiply attested between Paul and Mark and John. So you get multiple attestation there. And then today you have scholars that a lot of them are looking at multiple attestation in terms of the motif. So take, for example, Jesus' predictions about his passion, his imminent death and resurrection. Some of those may not be receive multiple attestation in terms of, Q and Mark or Mark and John, but they're multiply attested insofar as we find a pattern of these, a motif of these predictions throughout the different independent gospels, Mark and Q and John. And so that would be multiple attestation. So you may lose some part of multiple attestation because you no longer think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all wrote completely independently, but you still get plenty of stuff that is multiply attested. You just have to look at it a little bit differently.
Can I piggyback on that real quick?
Yes.
One of the things that you pointed out, actually, I have this book of yours, which I think is wonderful. One of the things that you pointed out, this is called The Case of the Resurrection of Jesus. If anyone would like to know, it's by also Dr. Habermas and Dr. Licona. And I just wanted to say, you pointed out within 150 years, we have all kinds of sources. I think it was even 42 sources, 9 of them secular, essentially, 9 of them who were non-Christians, and the rest of them were all Christians. And one of the things that I think is, as an historian, how many sources do we need to have some historical fact? I mean, do we need more than one, or do we need more than two? Is there some sort of a measure that we should accept as an historian?
Yeah, good question. Well, I would just clarify. So of those 42 sources, of course, they're not all going to be eyewitnesses, and some of them are going to be dependent on some of the other ones. So it's, we can say that there are 42 sources, and I think that's impressive. It's not like nobody's mentioning this in antiquity. A lot of people are mentioning it in antiquity, but they're not all independent sources, of course. So if you've got an eyewitness, a lot of things in antiquity are accepted as true based on one witness, and that person may not even be an eyewitness. But if you've got an eyewitness, I mean, that increases the probability of it occurring. If you've got two eyewitnesses that can be shown to be independent, that increases it. If you've got an unsympathetic source that testifies the same thing, that increases it even a lot more. So, we don't necessarily look at and say, well, we know for certain beyond any doubt that this happened. It's more of probability, that we have to talk in terms of probability when we talk about ancient history. And that doesn't apply just to Jesus. It applies to Julius Caesar and Sulla and Alexander the Great and Constantine, or whatever. It applies to all of them in that same sense.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. My next question is, then, just piggybacking on that, how would you date the Gospels then? Because if wouldn't, I mean, even though it wouldn't necessarily affect anything, whatever the belief is, with the Q source, how then would you date the Gospels? Like, and in this case, I'm asking not the scholar, but the person, Michael Licona. How would you date the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts and John.
Well, I think any New Testament scholar who's really looked at this, and if they're honest, okay, they would say they're all first century, but it's really difficult to give them a specific date. We can come up with various hypotheses, but there's speculation involved. It's just difficult to say. So, for example, you've got a couple early church fathers, several of them, who 4 or 5 of them that mention how, well, more than that actually, but they'll mention how Mark, came for, or I'm sorry, they'll say that Peter told Mark to, or I'm sorry, Peter was writing down what he heard. One more time here. Mark was writing down what he heard Peter say. Okay. But you have a couple of those early church fathers say that he did this while Peter was alive. And you have a couple of them say he did this after Peter had died. So if he did it while Peter was alive, well, if Peter dies around 64 or 65, then Mark had to have been written no later than 65, right? But if he did it after Peter died, then that would place the date of composition sometime after 64 or 65. But again, the early church fathers differ on this. And then the earliest person who reports it is Papias, and he's reporting it sometime in the 2nd century, but he's reporting testimony that he heard from an associate of one of Jesus' disciples while that disciple was still teaching and preaching. In other words, he heard this in the 1st century, that that Mark wrote down what he heard Peter say, but he doesn't mention whether he wrote it during his life, during Peter's lifetime. So it's really difficult to date Peter precisely. And if it's difficult to date Peter, and if Matthew and Luke were dependent on Peter, then that makes it kind of difficult to give them a precise date. Now, some would say, okay, Luke wrote Acts, Paul is still in prison at the end, and doesn't mention the Jerusalem temple being destroyed. And so therefore, Acts must have been written prior to 70. In fact, it's while Paul's still in prison, and I think it's Felix is now just taking over. So it's, he's probably writing it sometime in the early 60s, and Luke had to have been written before that, and Mark before that. That's possible, and that's a plausible argument. But then you'll also have even conservative scholars like Craig Keener and Ben Witherington who will say, well, Luke is not writing a a history of Paul here and what's going on. It's not his intent to talk about these things. He's writing a history of the first 3 decades of the Christian church. And so that puts you up into the early 60s. And so that's why he doesn't mention the death of Peter or of Paul or the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And Keener and Witherington will place the composition of Acts sometime in, somewhere between 70 and the early 80s. And these are conservative evangelical scholars. So there's arguments, there's counter arguments, there's arguments that John was written in the 90s. There's arguments that John was written prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's hard to tell. So I don't want to take any, if you're saying what do you're not interested in what scholars think, you're interested in what I think. I don't have any firm conviction other than they're written in the 1st century, but I focus more on what their sources were. Mark's source was Peter. His primary source was Peter, and that's profound. Luke's source was Paul and other eyewitnesses and Mark. And then you've got John, who, if not, he could have been written by one of Jesus' disciples, but if not, the author used one of Jesus' disciples as his primary source. I think it was John, the son of Zebedee, myself, but either way, they are rooted in eyewitness testimony, and I think that's what's important.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say that we even have atheist scholars like Dr. James Crossley, who actually publishes.
I think he calls himself an agnostic, but he might be an atheist.
I'm sorry. Yeah, he's an agnostic. I'm sorry about that. Let me correct that. He is an agnostic, and his doctoral dissertation was actually on the dating of the Gospel of Mark, and he actually takes a very, very surprising take on that. And he actually believes that it was written like within a few years after the death of Jesus. And I'm like, wow, why aren't we like taking this? Because it is impressive, that an agnostic is actually telling us that Mark was written a few years after the death of Jesus. I mean, I find that interesting.
Yeah. And I think your question's an important one. Why aren't we taking that and using it for like Christian apologetics or to support, to help with the Gospels? Well, Crossley's arguments, he hasn't been able to convince many scholars at all. And even as evangelicals who have a high view of Scripture, we've got to hold a position because we think it's true, not because it helps bolster our arguments. And we reject a position because we think it's false, not because in doing so it may help our case. We don't reject. I don't know how to put. Anyway, we got to be after truth. So I've seen some lame apologetics arguments for certain things, and I wish they worked, but I won't use them because I'm after truth. I'm not just looking at these things for pragmatic purposes. I'm after truth. So if Mark wasn't written in the 40s, if I don't think Mark was written in the 40s, well, I'm not going to use that, even though it might be good for apologetics, because I'm more interested in truth. But if we look at it and the arguments are good for it, even if most scholars don't accept it, but if we think personally that the arguments are good for it, then we should take it and use it. But we don't want to just accept an argument or a position because it helps our case. We want to accept it because it's true, and we want to use it because it's true.
Yeah. So what is your take on the birth narratives? Because in between Matthew and Luke, we have a lot of discrepancies in there.
Yeah.
And one of the cardinal doctrines for us as Christians is the virgin conception of, our Lord Jesus Christ. So some people have a problem with this because they say, okay, how can we actually reconcile these things?
Yeah. Well, I would say, when the Titanic sank, there were survivors who contradicted each other. Some said that the Titanic broke in half and then it sank, and others said, no, it went down in one piece. Now, these survivors were in lifeboats. It was the most terrifying night of their life. There's only one thing that they can see in the water, and it's a little over 800 feet long. It's all lit up and screams are coming from it. How do you get it wrong that this huge object, some say it breaks in half and then sinks, and then others said, nope, it went down in one piece? I don't know how the eyewitnesses contradict one another on this or got confused, but what I do know is that's no reason for us to conclude that the Titanic didn't sink. We just say that there are some peripheral details that we just can't account for. Now, it is interesting, I think, with the virgin birth account, there are some differences in it that I find very difficult to reconcile, primarily the chronology involved. So in Luke's gospel, you've got Joseph, Mary, and Jesus come into Jerusalem after the days of purification, which I think was around 40 days. And then Jesus dedicated. And then Luke says after that, they left Jerusalem and they went and settled in Nazareth. But that's impossible according to Matthew's chronology, because Matthew says they left Bethlehem, having been warned in a dream, and they fled to Egypt. And then afterward, they came back like a couple years later when Herod had died, and then they settled in Nazareth. So the chronology is very difficult to reconcile there. So is Luke simplifying the account, compressing the event, omitting the flight to Egypt? Could it be, and that Matthew didn't find it necessary or helpful to mention the dedication in the temple, or didn't know about it? I don't know. What's going on there? I don't know. But there's certainly independent accounts.
Yes, absolutely.
Much differences, and they both attest to the virgin birth. Now, I will say this. I hold to the virgin birth, probably because that's just the way I've always done it. I've always believed the virgin birth before I got into looking at things historically. And until I see something to discredit it, I'll just probably hold on to it. But I would say that even if the virgin birth didn't happen, Christianity would still be true because Jesus rose from the dead. We would just have to rethink some things theologically if it didn't happen, but it wouldn't disprove Christianity in any sense. So it's an interesting question. Like I said, I hold to the virgin birth, but I wouldn't lose sleep if somehow we learned that it didn't happen and that the story was invented.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that there are good historical reasons to think that it did happen because we have multiple attestation and so on. So and at the same time, it is a cardinal doctrine that we Christians believe about Jesus. But I'm saying from a historical point of view, I think we have a case.
I think we have a case for it. Yeah, it's not as strong as some of the others, like Jesus' death or his resurrection. And if I had the choice between having very strong evidence for the resurrection of Jesus or having very strong evidence for the virgin birth of Jesus, I'll take the resurrection every day.
Yeah. And now let's talk a little bit about your book, because you've been talking about transferal, displacement, and things like that. So many people are not familiar with all of that kind of stuff. So tell us about your book and all of those techniques, how you found out about them and what they are. I'm talking about transferal, displacement, conflation, compression, spotlighting, simplification, expansion, and paraphrasing.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot you're asking me to cover there. I'll just say a couple of things, but let me first and primarily just refer people to my website, risenjesus.com, and to my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and then type in my name, Mike Licona, in the search, and my channel will come up. And I've got lectures on, why there are differences in the Gospels, and I discuss these things. So, the short answer, I guess I could say, is, let's see, let me just give an example. Okay, so literary spotlighting. If the Gospels are ancient biographies or have much in common with it, then we would expect them to have some of the same literary conventions that other biographies of the period. So what I did was I took Plutarch, And I looked at him because he's the finest biographer of all antiquity. A lot of classicists would say that. And of the 50 biographies he wrote that have survived, there are 9 in which we can take that deal with the late Roman Republic and the beginning of the transition to Roman Empire. And a lot of the stories, we can find 36 stories that are reported in 2 or more of them. Some of them are reported 6 or 7 times. So we can look at how Plutarch tells the same story on multiple occasions, like the assassination of Julius Caesar, or the Catilinarian conspiracy, or the Lupercalia festival. And we can look at this and see how Plutarch tells the same story, and he tells them with differences. So it's the same author using the same sources, writing around the same time, and yet he reports a different, with a lot of differences. And when we look at them very carefully, we find that these are the same kinds of differences we find in the Gospels. Obviously, Plutarch isn't trying to contradict himself. So what's going on here? And we see a number of different patterns patterns of these differences. So one, literary spotlighting would be things like there are multiple people that are present and that are engaged in activity, but Plutarch mentions these people on one occasion, but maybe in another rendition of that in a different life, he mentions only one person doing that act. Well, we find this kind of stuff going on in the Gospels. The literary spotlighting is the most common literary technique that I find Plutarch doing. I could just give you many, many examples. But just to be brief here, to come to the Gospels, you come to the resurrection narratives. Was there one angel like we find in Matthew and Mark, or were there 2 like in Luke and John? Well, perhaps literary spotlighting is going on there, and Matthew and Mark are just featuring the angel who's giving the message. This kind of stuff, like I said, is very common throughout Plutarch. And then what happens? You've got how many women came to the tomb? Well, the synoptics report several women. John only reports Mary Magdalene coming, but he doesn't say only Mary Magdalene. He only mentions Mary. And then when she runs back, seeing the tomb's empty, and she talks to Peter and the beloved disciples, she says, they've taken the Lord, and we, plural, don't know where they laid him. So it seems like there's literary spotlighting going on there. And then it says in John that Peter and the beloved disciple got up and they ran to the tomb, and they found it as Mary had said. But in Luke, it says Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, was it Peter or the beloved disciple? Well, Luke may be using literary spotlighting there. In fact, he's certain to, because just 12 verses later, when Jesus is talking to the Emmaus disciples and he's hiding his identity, he says, why the long faces, guys? And they say, oh, you're the only one in here, Jerusalem, that doesn't know what happened. I mean, gosh, we had this guy, Jesus, and he was crucified on Friday. And some of the women went to the tomb this morning. They discovered it empty. And then some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Some of our own. Wait a minute, Luke, just 12 verses earlier, you only mentioned Peter. That's right. But he obviously knows that there were others involved. He only mentions Peter, though. He's doing literary spotlighting. So there you got 3 or 4 examples of spotlighting, potential or certain, going on in the resurrection narratives themselves. So if we read the Gospels through the lenses of ancient biography, then a lot of these differences in them just kind of fade away, because we can view the stories more clearly if we read them through the lenses of the genre in which they were written.
Yeah, that's excellent. And something I really want to press you on is what do you think about paraphrase? Because you actually use that word, especially when it comes to John, the Gospel of John. So I want you to define, and I'm going to get a little bit controversial here. What do you mean by paraphrase?
Well, paraphrase isn't necessarily exactly how we think about it today, ancient paraphrase. So, I mean, there is some, of course, some similarities, but there are some differences. So when you lived in that time, if you were getting educated, it was during your secondary education years, during your teens, that you already knew how to read and you knew how to write, but they were teaching you how to write well. And so they had what were called progymnasmata, which means preliminary exercises. They would have these rhetorical handbooks that would provide these exercises in them to teach you how to write, how to change up a story. So today we might look at and say, what would you call it? Gosh, I ought to know the term right off since I'm a professor. What do you call it when you're, it's eluding me at the moment. What do you call it when you're copying off of another paper and you're not
plagiarize?
Plagiarism, yes. So what they would do in antiquity is they'd have these exercises where you would take a paragraph out of an ancient source, like you have a guy named Theon in the 1st century probably, who wrote a rhetorical handbook in Greek. And so he would take a paragraph out of Thucydides from the 4th century, I think it was 4th, 5th century BC, the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he would say, all right, I want you to paraphrase this now. I want you to change this. And he'd give you different exercises. So one way would be to change the syntax. So that'd be the grammatical structure of it. And there were many different ways to do that in Greek, more so than we would in English. But so, for example, if it was John 1:1, if you were to say the Word was God, you could say that in many different ways. The Word was God, or you could say God was the Word, or you could say the Word God was, or God the Word was. You could put it in so many different ways. Change the syntax. So that'd be a way of paraphrasing. You could use a synonym. You would substitute a word with a synonym. Or you could add to it in order to clarify the position, or you could subtract in order to abbreviate, or you could change a statement to a question, or a question to a statement or a command, or you could take something and that was stated by one person, and to make it a little more fun to read, you could turn it into a dialogue. So we find all these or like Quintilian at one point says that a good historian, when writing a narrative, will add details in order to place a person within a context to make it just seem like they are there. So, like, for example, in John's gospel, you've got it talks about when Jesus is feeding the 5,000, it was saying the grass was green. I mean, this could have just been a way for John, using this narrative device recommended by Quintilian and others. This is the way to write history, to just make the people feel more like they're there. It doesn't necessarily mean anything else. So that's the kind, you're supposed to create a narrative to get people feeling like they are present. So there were ways of telling the story, and that you would do things in antiquity that we might not do or appreciate historians doing today. But we see these kinds of things happening all the time in the Gospels. I mean, I could give you several examples, but let's see. What would be... all right, so transferal and simplification, okay, compression of events. I think so. In one case, you've got a centurion who comes to Jesus and he says, "I've got a servant who's sick. Please heal her." And this is in Matthew, and Jesus says, "Yep, I'm sorry. Yeah, Jesus says, yep, all right, let's go." And so the centurion says, no, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. But look, I'm a man of authority just like you. So just say the word and my daughter will be, my servant will be healed. And Jesus praises the centurion and heals his servant. Well, when you read the same story, I think it's in Luke, it might be in Mark. The centurion doesn't come. The centurion sends sends Jewish leaders to make the request, and they say, "Oh, the centurion is worthy of this." And Jesus says, "All right, let's go." And then the centurion finds out about it and sends some friends out, and the friends say on behalf of the centurion, "Hey, he says I'm not worthy for you to come under the roof," and yada yada. And Jesus praises the centurion and heals the servant from a distance. So the difference is it's either Mark or Luke. Let's just call it Luke. The centurion never comes out. He sends emissaries out to talk to Jesus, whereas in Matthew has simplified it. And rather than saying he sent all these people, he simplifies it and just has the centurion himself come out and do it. Well, in reality, the centurion probably never went out to see Jesus, but Matthew simplifies it and then transfers what had been on the lips of these emissaries to the lips of the centurion because those were his own. And I can show you where Plutarch does the same thing. This is common stuff. So it's not really a problem. But that's kind of, those are the different kind of techniques of paraphrasing. When it comes to John's gospel, then it becomes a little more complex. And John's gospel is difficult. You have scholars who have devoted their careers, their academic careers, to studying John's gospel and trying to understand what it is. Paul Anderson is one of those. My former doctoral supervisor, Jan van der Vaart. You've got many others and others who have really devoted a lot of time, like Craig Keener, Ben Witherington, F.F. Bruce, people like that. And even conservative scholars will say that John is just pretty much giving us a dynamic paraphrase of what happened. That John is taking the words of Jesus, he's paraphrasing them to bring out the deeper meaning of them, and then recasting Jesus' words in his own Johannine idiom. That's mainly what a lot of Johannine specialists will say. Because the words of Jesus in John, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, are very different in the way he says things in John than the way he says things in the synoptics. The message is pretty much the same in agreement, but the way he says them in John is far different than what we find, generally speaking, in the synoptic gospels. So it's like N.T. Wright, a very prominent conservative New Testament scholar, has said, I think of John like I think of my wife. I love her very much, but I do not claim to understand her. And if you can have these specialists in Johannine literature who are willing to say some things like that, then I have no problem saying, okay, I know something is going on here. I know paraphrasing to a very large extent is going on with John. But I don't know exactly what's going on. But John is based on eyewitness testimony. And so I give John a lot of weight.
Okay, but what I'm talking about is, let's take a different approach. Let's say, even though I don't think history is about the past, because we don't have access to the past. But what I'm trying to this is my view, but what I'm trying to say is, if we were to take if we were to do some kind of like time travel or something like that, would you say the ego eimi passages, the I am passages in the Gospel of John, if we were to go back in there to listen to Jesus, do you think what John reports about the I am passages, do you think that could be true historically speaking?
I think it could be true historically speaking.
Okay, but can we actually like point out, hey, look, he says, I am, I am life, I am this, all of the I am passages that we have. Hello?
Yeah, I think there's 7 of them.
Yeah, okay. Can we actually say that happened in history?
No, I don't think we can say that with any kind of certainty.
I'm talking about probabilistically speaking. Can we actually say
I would say a lot of the Johannine specialists would say Jesus probably did not say the I am sayings as clearly as we find them in John. Did he say something like it? Yeah, probably. But did he say them like that? Like before Abraham was, I am. A lot of Johannine specialists, of which I'm not one. A lot of Johannine specialists would say no, and I think there's some decent reasons for that. So, for example, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is often cryptic publicly about who he is. He's telling the demons, do not tell people who I am. Be silent. Don't tell them I'm the Son of God. Don't tell He tells his disciples, do not reveal to people that I'm the Messiah. My time will come. It's not now. So he talks in parables a lot. In fact, in Matthew, it says that Jesus did not speak to them except in parables. So Jesus, at least he's speaking lots in parables. In the synoptics, things are cryptic about some of his teachings and especially about who he is. But in John, he never speaks in parables. In John, he's not cryptic about who he is. He's saying, I am the light of the world. Before Abraham was, I am. So if he's cryptic in the synoptics about even being the Messiah, do we really expect that he's coming out publicly and saying, hey guys, I'm God, I'm the I am? But did he say things or do things throughout his life that would suggest that he believed and made claims, whether explicit or implicit, that he was God? I think he did. When we read Mark's gospel, in view of it being the genre of ancient biography, which Plutarch, in the most famous passage that he has, that's his first chapter in his Life of Alexander the Great, he says that he's writing biography, and so therefore he's going to provide accounts of what Alexander said and did in order to illuminate who he was, what kind of a person he was. That's what biography was supposed to do. Now take that to Mark's gospel, which is biography. What's it start off? As Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. Well, that's referring to God, of course. Well, it's not Jesus preparing the way for God. It's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. So what is Mark saying about Jesus from the very beginning? He's God. Then you come to chapter 2. Jesus heals a paralytic, forgives him his sins. The Jewish leaders say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Yep, you understand the implications behind what he is saying, what he's doing. Chapter 3, I think that's where he has cast out demons, and the Jewish leaders are accusing him, saying Satan cast out Satan, and Jesus saying no. And he gives the illustration of a strong man. If you're going into a strong man's house and you want to rob him, you have to bind the strong man, and then you can plunder his goods. And what he's basically saying is his exorcism shown that he has bound the strong man, who is Satan, and now is plundering his kingdom of souls. Well, what human binds Satan? What prophet binds Satan? Even the highest angel, Michael, in Jude, would not even rebuke Satan. He says, the Lord rebuke you. But here you've got Jesus who is binding Satan. So what does that say about who Jesus is? Chapter 4, you've got Jesus calming the wind and the waves, which the Old Testament says only God does. Chapter 5, he raises someone from the dead, which the Old Testament says only God does. Chapter 6, you've got Jesus walking on water, which the Old Testament says only God can do that. So you go all throughout Mark's gospel, and he is illustrating through Jesus's deeds that this guy is God. He's divine in some sense. So Jesus did and said certain things that suggest that he believed that he was God. So does John take all that because he doesn't mention a lot of the deeds of Jesus? Is he paraphrasing these things in a very loose way and rewriting them and having Jesus say things explicitly which were implicit in his real life? Maybe. That's possible. I don't know what's going on, but I do find some of these things quite interesting.
I was also going to ask you, when it comes to the Gospel of John, what is your take on the cleansing of the temple? Because my impression is that you don't take the traditional view of of Jesus, cleansing the temple 2 times. I think you take a different view on that.
Yeah, I don't know that that's a traditional view. I'd say most scholars today think that there was only one temple cleansing and that John has displaced it from the last week of Jesus' life and put it in the first week of Jesus's ministry.
Background noise here.
In order to frame the entirety of Jesus' ministry as a Passover, because Jesus is doing this at the Passover. Is that what's going on? I don't know. Were there 2 temple cleansings? Maybe. It wouldn't surprise me if there were 2 temple cleansings. It wouldn't surprise me if there were only one and John displaced it. You've got such things like that going on elsewhere, like the women who anointed Jesus. I think it's pretty clear that John displaces that from 2 days before Passover and makes it 6 days before Passover, so he can link it, Mary anointing Jesus with Lazarus being raised from the dead, since they're, related. And that's the kind of stuff that Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century, who in his book, How to Write History, said you're supposed to do these things. Link stories together when there's overlapping material. You link them together like a chain. And Quintilian said the same thing, only he used a different illustration, whereas it's like men lined up next to each other and locking arms together like a link, like a chain. You're supposed to connect stories that way. So that would have been the proper way of writing history, and John seems to have done that, in my opinion, with the woman anointing Jesus. And so in that case, I have no problem if he did that with displacing the temple cleansing and placing it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Plutarch does that kind of stuff too with some of his stuff. And so does Tacitus, who is regarded as the greatest of ancient historians. So the best of historians and biographers did it. I have no problem. I see John doing it. I have no problem with that. And he may have done it with Jesus' death and the day of his crucifixion.
Yeah, I'm seeing, because a lot of the Christian writers and most scholars that I have read, they actually. Hello.
Okay, I got you. I'm sorry, that was my bad. I had noise back there, so I tried to make it quiet in the background. So I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry about that.
That's my fault.
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say that the vast majority of historians, like Leon Morris, Tasker, I believe even F.F. Bruce and people like that. There's so many scholars that I can actually mention to you who would actually think that the cleansing of the temple took place 2 times instead of just 1.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there are plenty of them. I don't know that'd be the vast majority, but there are a number of them, and they may be right. I don't think it really matters.
Okay. And yeah, I'm going to let you take over now, Stephanie.
I know John has a question that he's been saving up for a while, so I want to turn it over to John for a second.
Yeah, so my question for you, Mike, is I don't know where that background noise is coming from.
I don't know.
The fan.
Is that you, Joe? Oh,
is that making any noise?
I don't hear it now.
I don't hear it now.
Oh, maybe it's not. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, at Matthew 27 in the crucifixion narrative,
thanks a lot. You bringing this up.
I believe it. When does it come around?
52 and 53.
52 and 53. Yep. Yeah, it goes from the temple and the rocks were split, and then it goes into the tombs are opened, but many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection. So this is describing the crucifixion, not the resurrection, but yet you have this in here. So do you hold that this is apocalyptic imagery in this passage?
Well, I can't know for sure. Okay, it's kind of difficult. It's a difficult passage, and many scholars they disagree on what's going on here. But I tend to think that it is special effects that is going on. Would I die for that? Nope. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. But looking at the evidence, that's my hunch. And the reason being is you've got numerous Greco-Roman and Jewish writings who mention similar phenomena, and it seems like they are doing this in order to highlight the significance of an event. So, for example, Josephus, right before the temple is destroyed, he mentions how a cow gave birth to a lamb in the temple, that there was a light that shone down and at night for half an hour, I think it was, and it was brighter than the sun, and it shone down on the temple. There were voices in the temple that said, "We are now leaving this place." Fighting was seen in the heavens. There was a comet. That the doors of the temple, which took more than 20 men opened by themselves. When Cassius Dio reports that Caesar went into Egypt, it said that the doors of the temple of Zeus, which took many men to opened by themselves. Fighting was seen in the heavens. There was an eclipse of the sun, a comet, that there were pale phantoms that were seen walking around. There was a woman with a hair that was snakes as hair, and she terrified the city by walking around. You've got Livy, who mentions that when Julius Caesar died, there was an eclipse of the sun. There was a comet, that black intestines were seen outside of cattle. Streams stopped moving. Mount Etna erupted. Phantoms, ghosts were seen walking around at sunset. The same kind of stuff. We find this in multiple ancient sources like this. In Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, they're speaking in tongues and they're being accused of being drunk. And Peter says, no, this is in fulfillment of Joel the prophet, where young men will have dreams, old men will have visions. The Spirit of the Lord will fall upon you, and whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. It's interesting how he mentions visions and dreams, although that's not what's going on. What's going on is speaking in tongues. But he sees all of this kind of imagery as what's happening in Acts chapter 2. And so I'm hearing that noise again. I think it might be on Joel's end.
Yeah.
Can you mute yours for a moment, Joel? There you go. So it's interesting when you go to that Joel passage. It not only mentions old men having dreams, young men having visions, but it's talking about the sun going dark and either the moon turning into blood or the stars falling out of the sky. And it's funny, in Acts chapter 2, Peter's saying, this is what's happened in your presence today. Call in the name of the Lord and be saved. But of course, the sun didn't go dark. The moon didn't turn into blood. The stars didn't fall out of the sky. It seems to be apocalyptic or poetic kind of imagery, like special effects, meant to intensify and to say that this is this event has cosmic or divine significance behind it. I guess I'll just say one other thing. When I look at the ancient literature, and there's an interesting book out, it's a catalog of comets in the Greco-Roman literature from 500 BC through 400 AD. It's written by a friend of mine named John Ramsey. I think it's dated 2001 or somewhere around there, maybe a little later. And he provides what he found every occurrence of the mention of a comet in the Greco-Roman literature during those 900 years. He provides the text in its original language. He translates it. And then he sees if there's any corroboration that a comet appeared in that time. Like sometimes we can corroborate that it was Halley's Comet or the Hale-Bopp Comet or another comet that was known to have appeared around that time. Or it's multiply attested in the Chinese literature, which would have had no contact at all with the Roman literature, Greco-Roman literature. And then what's really interesting is there are a couple of cases where there's a comet and there's an eclipse of the sun reported at the same time. These are like portents to emphasize the drama of what's going on. This is an event of cosmic and even divine significance. Well, NASA has a website where you can go there and click on a particular geographic region and then enter a year, and it will tell you whether an eclipse of the sun was visible within that region that year. And so there are some cases where we can confirm that there was a comet that was visible that year, but there was no eclipse of the sun visible within that region that year. And that suggests to us that these ancient authors could commingle historical phenomena and add these other phenomena in order to intensify the drama of what was going on. So we might say, yeah, 9/11 was an earth-shaking event, and there was an eclipse of the sun that day, and a cow gave birth to a lamb that day. You know, that's the kind of things that they would do back then. It was an event of great significance. It rained cats and dogs. You know, we use that kind of language today for certain things. And we know that they used it some back then. So my hunch is that that's what Matthew is doing with these raised saints. It's very similar to Greco-Roman and Jewish literature with some of these. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. I guess one final thing I would add is if you accept it as historical, there are some challenges. So, for example, were they raised in a resurrection body like Jesus, or were these saints raised in a body like Lazarus and Jairus's daughter and the widow's son, where they would just die again? Well, if it's the latter, they're raised in the same kind of body just to die again. Well, they're raised when Jesus dies around 3:00 Friday night, but they don't afternoon, but they don't come out of their tombs until after Jesus is raised and they go into Jerusalem. Well, what are they doing in those, 36 to 40 hours in the meantime? Would we have seen them pacing back and forth in their graves had we been there? And then they come out, they haven't eaten for a few days or drank anything. So they're thirsty, they're hungry, they're homeless. What happens to them? Why aren't they reported by anyone else other than Matthew? Such an amazing event. And they'd have some interesting stories. And who were these saints? That leaves some questions. The other option is they are raised in a resurrection body. But if that's the case, then that contradicts Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 15:20 that Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. He's the first to be raised with the resurrection body. So what do we do with that? So I don't know. There's some questions. I think it's a difficult text. I don't think we can be really certain about anything there or have a firm position. But my hunch is that we are looking at special effects going on that was part and parcel of portents within the Jewish and Greco-Roman literature.
Yeah, that's a good answer. You brought in a lot of good examples from history that I was very unaware of. So I appreciate that. And John, we've had a few questions. Actually, we've had a whole bunch of questions from the audience to the point where I don't even think I can get to them all. So I apologize to the people in the audience if they put in some questions. But I wanted to ask one that I saw right off the bat from Pine Creek Doug, who would love to have you on his channel. He's already noted that. He's an atheist, and he wants to know if you know of any professional historians who came to Christianity after doing their own investigation of Jesus and the resurrection.
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to think about that. There is an interesting example of a Jewish historian named Pinchas Lapid. And he didn't come to Christianity, but he looked at the evidence for the resurrection. And at the end of his book, he makes an interesting statement. So he distinguishes between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And many of you have probably heard this before, but if you haven't, I'll give you a way that you'll never forget the difference between them. So the main difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is the Pharisees believed in life after death. They believed in a heaven. And so they were fair, you see. And the Sadducees did not believe in a life after death. When you died, that was it, no heaven. So they were sad, you see. So now you'll never forget the difference between them. So what Lapid goes on after getting into a historical investigation of the resurrection of Jesus, he says, regarding the resurrection of the dead on the final day, I have always been a Pharisee. Regarding the resurrection of Jesus, I used to be a Sadducee, but having looked at the evidence, I am no longer a Sadducee. So that's kind of interesting. Now, he believed that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead based on the data. But he concluded that, yes, Jesus rose and he's the savior of the Gentiles, but Jews still wait for a Messiah. So, I mean, if I were to answer that, I'd say, well, gee, if Jesus is claiming to be Messiah and he rises from the dead, maybe you ought to consider that he is. And if it doesn't fit in with your interpretations of prophecy, maybe you ought to consider that your interpretations of messianic prophecy may not be correct. Maybe Jesus is. But either way, you've got Pinchas Lapid, who, again, a Jewish scholar. He didn't think Jesus rose from the dead. He did his investigation, and he concluded Jesus rose from the dead bodily. So that would be one historian. I have to think about if there's some others, but none other come to my mind immediately.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of in the 1800s, William Ramsay, but he wasn't a historian, but he was someone who had investigated a lot of the details around it. And so I'm going to ask John. John, did you have another? I'm going to run and turn my light on real quick too. But John, did you have another question?
Not at the moment. Oh yeah, here's one. Would you like to come on my channel sometime?
From you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could do that. Maybe we could look. I do a lot of these things, so maybe we could combine. It's you and the atheist guy. Maybe we could do a Google Hangout where you're both there, and we could combine the two together, and then you can have it on both your channels.
That'd be interesting.
That would be good. So did you want to, would you like to, one of the big questions, and I think an overall overarching question, and I think you've answered a lot of this stuff, but basically, if people come up to you and they say, what is the evidence? If you kind of are asked really quickly, walking through the hallway in the university, what evidence do you have for the historicity of Jesus's resurrection, or for Jesus's resurrection in total? What would be one of your best arguments? And I know there's a ton of arguments, but what would be one of the things that you think you could say that would be pretty convincing?
Well, I don't know if it'd be convincing. That's, it just depends on the person, whether they're really open-minded and, they're all that stuff. But if I was trying to make it really, really simple and fairly quick, I'd say, look, I'm going to have to just give you some things. And if you want, I can unpack them, So one thing would be, it's virtually unanimous among scholars, even skeptical ones, that Jesus' disciples had experiences they were convinced were the risen Jesus appearing to them. And so we need to explain the nature of those appearances and look at possibilities. Did Jesus actually appear to them? Is that the best explanation? Or were they experiencing a hallucination? Or did they lie about this? Or did they see an identical twin brother of Jesus? What's the best explanation of what was going on? And when you include other data, the resurrection hypothesis is the only one that can explain that data adequately.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's a really good example, looking at the apostles, because I think when you take all of the information that we have, and I've seen yours from your book with Dr. Habermas, and I've also seen, looking at William Lane Craig, and when he takes 5 key points that most historians agree upon and says, what's the best explanation for all of these points? And really, you could use swoon theory or the twin theory or any of those kind of things, but they don't explain all of the points that historians agree upon. So
that's right, SJ. You're right.
So I'm sold. but just I see Joel. Joel, you're back here. Did you want to ask any? Did you have anything else outstanding for Dr. Licona? Oh, wait, you've got your mute on still here.
Yes, hello?
You're back.
Oh my God. Okay, just one question I want to ask you. And your name is synonymous, unfortunately, with controversy when it comes to the doctrine of inerrancy.
Yeah.
What is your take on that? I mean, I truly feel bad the way you were treated, with all of that controversy. And I just want to know your take on the doctrine of inerrancy, because it is a big thing here in America.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that Christianity is true because Jesus rose from the dead, right? We talked about this earlier. So even if there were errors, even if the Bible is not inerrant, Christianity is still true. And I think that's very important for us as Christians to realize. Okay. That said, even ultra-conservative scholars like Norman Geisler they acknowledge that inerrancy only applies to the autographs. It does not apply to our current biblical text. And even Geisler will go as far as to saying that there are errors in the current text. For example, in his book, When Critics Ask, he and Thomas Howe deal with a number of the numerical discrepancies between Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and conclude these are obviously scribal errors. That's what they say, obviously scribal errors. So they acknowledge that the text, the biblical text that we have today that you're holding in your hand, is not inerrant, and inerrancy only applies to the autographs. So I would say, I think it interesting that for someone who has spent their career focusing on the doctrine of inerrancy, he affirms the inerrancy of a text we no longer have while denying the inerrancy of the text we have. And so we have to ask, what is the actual importance of the doctrine of inerrancy, right? So do I think the Bible is inerrant? I do, but I would have a looser definition than Geisler on what inerrancy is. I personally like the Lausanne Covenant, Lausanne, I think it is, the Lausanne Covenant, which was signed by John Stott and Billy Graham, and about 3,000 evangelicals. The Chicago Statement, which was started by Geisler, Sproul, and Packer, was signed by a little over 300 evangelicals. The numbers don't really matter, so I'm not trying to make an issue there. But I like the Lausanne Covenant because this is the Bible is true and everything that it affirms. And I think that is sufficiently vague that you can look at that in a couple different ways. Is it inerrant in all that it teaches? In that case, if there were some errors in the Gospels or in the Bible in peripheral details, it could still be considered inerrant in all that it affirms, all that it teaches, while not necessarily being inerrant in every detail. And since there are so many instances in the Bible, maybe 12.5 in the Gospels, but even more throughout the Bible, that have they're reasonably good candidates for being errors. Are they? I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they aren't. I don't think we can know. But since they are reasonably good candidates for being errors, I don't think that we should be so firm as to say there can't be any errors in our Bible, because even Geisler admits that there are errors in our Bible, right? The only difference is he don't think that there were any in the autographs. So were there any in the autographs? I don't know. We don't have the autographs. We don't even know the method by which God inspired the earliest the biblical authors. So if we don't know the methods that God used, it's hard to go further and define inerrancy, real strictly. It's just really difficult, I think. So my view is that the Bible is inerrant in all that it affirms, all that it teaches. I'm comfortable with that. If there's an error in a peripheral detail, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. Jesus rose from the dead. And so Christianity is true, period.
Yeah, and Paul said that, and I back that same exact idea. So I think as long as we have that major truth, I think that we can say that clearly Jesus is Lord.
Amen.
So let me have you let us know how people can find you. I think we're getting towards the end here. We've already used your time for the last 90 minutes, so I want to be not take up too much more of your time. But if you could let us know, how can people find you? You mentioned one of your websites and your YouTube channel, and I'm going to put both of those in this video. Also, I know we can find you on social media if you want to detail that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm on Twitter at Michael Licona, Licona. And I look at Twitter, but I don't really look too much at the messages, so I won't really respond to those. On social media, I'm more active on my public figure Facebook page. Now, it's important you understand it's my public figure. I've also got a personal one, but I don't. I'm trying to get the number of friends down. I used to have 5,000, and I've whittled it down to about 900 because I don't see what my actual friends are doing, people I know. So what I do is I point people to my public figure page. And that's where I do most of the posting and the kind of stuff that people are interested in anyway. They don't want to hear about my dog and things like that. They want to hear about what's, these kind of things that we're discussing here. And so you go to facebook.com/michael.r.licona. And that's my public figure page. And just like it, and you can follow me there. So there, or my YouTube channel, or my website.
Excellent. And so, which books I mentioned one of your books that you've written, but you've got some other ones. What are a couple of your most recent books that you'd like to share that people should know about and might want to go out and pick up?
Well, let's see. I forgot which one you mentioned. Was it the resurrection one or the gospel differences?
Yes, the resurrection. I mentioned the Case for the Resurrection.
Case for the Resurrection. That's a popular level book. So it's like a self-study book on, how the arguments for the resurrection, how to answer others. It's meant for the Christian. If you really want to get in depth with it and really cover the things that will help you, talk to skeptics online, then I would say my real thick book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. That's more of an academic book, but even if you're not an academic, it's readable. And then also the book where I answer the question, why are there differences in the Gospels? And that's title is, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And that came out 2 years ago. That's more of an academic book. So if you're not used to reading academic stuff, that might be a little bit heavy for you. But I'm not saying it for you, that to you, SJ. Obviously, you and Joel, that have read this kind of stuff, so it wouldn't be a problem for you. But for some of your viewers who may not be accustomed to academic stuff, it might be a little heavy. This year, I'm writing a popular level book on gospel differences that will provide some fresh examples not included in the academic one. And then I will deal with the issues such as how does this impact divine inspiration and the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And it sounds like you're very busy. And I know that the university has already kicked off its semester. So I know you're back in classes, like you mentioned before. Sounds like you said you had a graduate level class that's looking at some very detailed stuff that we've talked about.
So at HBU, let me just promote our program a little and brag about it. I mean, look, there are numerous schools who have great apologetics programs. So you've got Biola, you've got Liberty University, and several others. They've got some apologetics programs at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. You've got Southern Evangelical Seminary, a number of good places where you can learn apologetics. HBU, Houston Baptist University, we started one a few years ago. Personally, I think we've got the #1 out there. And I know there's some others, but the reason I think we're #1, not only do we have a faculty that is every bit as good, if not better, than any of the others out there. Great names. But we offer 2 different tracks. So some can go with the philosophical apologetics, which does stuff like we've been talking on here, plus arguments for God's existence, the kind of stuff you see William Lane Craig using. Or you can go what's called cultural apologetics, which is more of C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, kind of stuff Ravi Zacharias does and all that. It's more like with the arts, and it's a different way of relating. In fact, it's the way a lot of people relate today. We all have different ways and preferences. So sometimes when my students say, well, which way should I go? Say, well, you go with the way you're most drawn to. So if you watch William Lane Craig and you think his approach is too robotic, then you probably should go cultural apologetics. But if you listen to Ravi Zacharias and you start banging your head on the table and saying, please get to the point, then you're probably should go philosophical apologetics. We offer both tracks, and we also offer a fully accredited program that you can do either on campus or at a distance. So most of our students are professionals involved in their careers, and they just want to learn more. We've got pharmacists, we have attorneys, we have all kinds of people who are in the ministry, and they get in there and they chime in through all over the country to do our program. And they can get a fully accredited Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics that will prepare you. You can go further. If you do a thesis track, you can go into a PhD from there. Like I said, we got tremendous faculty at HBU. So that's a little about our program. We are competitive in terms of our prices. I think we're no more than anyone else. So I think we got a great program. So come on in and join me in my classes, and be happy to have you.
Oh, that's exciting. And I never realized that they distinguish cultural from philosophical. I had no idea. I really like all of those people you mentioned too. I like Ravi Zacharias, and I like William Lane Craig and C.S. Lewis and J.K. Chesterton. So they're all great. So, and I think isn't Lee Strobel there, and Nancy Pearcey?
Nancy Pearcey, Lee Strobel. Boy, there's so many. Jerry Walls. We got, well, he's in the philosophy, Master of Arts in philosophy. You've got Michael Ward, who's the leading C.S. Lewis scholar in the world.
Wow.
At Oxford. He teaches here at HBU. We just have, I got Mary Jo Sharp and so many others. We got phenomenal faculty for these things. So, again, William Lane Craig, I'd put us up against anyone.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, because I've also noticed that Biola has a lot of very good ones. So, and SES. So, I mean, it's kind of neat, strategically located all around at different pinpoints in the United States. So you're representing the Southwest, and
And let me add one more thing, SJ. So I tease Gary Habermas and I tease Craig Hazen at Biola. I'll say, at Biola and Liberty, You can get in a program and you guys will teach the students what to think. But at HBU, we teach students how to think. The reason I say that is, and it's in jest, but the reason I say that is HBU has a much broader evangelical tent than either Liberty or Biola, or especially a place like Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is very limited and ultra conservative. Okay. Even though a number of their professors are pretty cool. Like we've got Catholic professors, we have Protestant professors from different denominations. It's not just Baptist. We have those like myself who affirm biblical inerrancy. We have those who, like Craig Evans, who believe in the divine inspiration, the absolute authority in Scripture, the infallibility of Scripture, but they don't think it's inerrant. We have complementarians and we have egalitarians. We have Calvinists and we have Arminians. And we all get along. I mean, we can understand a Catholic and a Protestant getting along, but a Calvinist and an Arminian? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, no way. That's amazing.
We all get along at HBU because we are so we have a very broad evangelical tent that has all the faculty affirm pretty much like a C.S. Lewis mere Christianity. We believe God created, but we have old earth, young earth, theistic evolutionists. So we believe God created, we believe the virgin birth, the deity of Jesus, his atoning death, his bodily resurrection, he's going to return, and the divine inspiration of scriptures. And after that, we have got various views. And so we present the different views and we encourage the students to develop their own, to think through these things and to come to their own conclusions. So there's no confession, strong pinpoint confession they have to come to. It's really good research. And this is, you arrive at your conclusion. Here are the different views. So I like that myself. And that's one thing that we offer that no other university or seminary that offers apologetics offers.
That's actually a major strength. And I think about that because I think about C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. That's what brought me back to Christianity. I had wavered for many years. And the neat thing about that book is the way it's written. And even he pointed it out in the book. He actually asked Protestants, he asked Catholics, he asked all these different sorts of people from different walks of Christianity to look at his Mere Christianity and to give it a good judge. And they all gave feedback, and he blended it in a way that now when we read it, from whichever perspective we come, it makes sense to us from our viewpoint. So I like that you have that mix in your school. And I think that's really nice because there are one of the big questions people ask Christians. They say, well, which one's correct? Which sect is correct? And I always answer, we have all these doors that lead to the same room. But there are different ways to look at that. And I think that it's nice that you get along. And I think that sets an example for Christians.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah,
and it's neat. About a third of our students at HBU are not Christians. Now, everyone, of course, in the apologetics master's degree is, but about a third of our students. I teach 2 undergraduate courses in the fall, and I'd say about a third of the students are either Muslims or Buddhists or agnostics. So, it's we all have a good time.
That's really interesting because I told you I have a friend who was the dean over there at Houston Baptist, Mike Weeks. He was the dean over there for a little while. He's now over at the Citadel. But he said that a lot of Muslims came to Houston Baptist. We actually have a lot at our school too, but I'm at a secular school. So and he thought that it was because one thing that they liked about Houston Baptist was there is a family environment that's, you don't necessarily have to follow the Christian faith. You just sort of endorse the family values and the idea of just being a good person and doing that kind of thing. So I think that might attract people from all these different walks.
Yeah. We have morality and we don't have co-ed dorms and things like that, but and we do have a family environment there. It's very warm and people get along and it's cool. But we are very deliberate that we are Christian and with no apologies. And, so we're excited about that.
That's really good. So what do you think, Joel? We're about ready to tie up. And do you want to let us know where we can find you too, Joel?
Hello?
I gotcha. Oh, I was able to hear you.
Well, while he's trying to figure that out, SJ, hey, so your other one who was on here,
JMD Apologetics. He
Yep,
wants
JMD
to.
Apologetics. If that person and the atheist who'd like me to have me on the show, if you'd like to do this again, SJ, the Google Hangout, and have those two guys on where they can be asking questions, I'd be happy to do that.
Oh, how fun. Yeah, I would.
You're a wonderful
Excellent.
host. So I'd be
Yeah.
happy to do that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that I don't know if you caught that, Joel, but Pine Creek Doug, I've been on his channel and he's pretty funny. He gets in the chats of a lot of different conversations I've been on YouTube, so it's a lot of fun. So
I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Licona, for all the work you have done. I mean, in my life, you have helped me tremendously, you know, through your books and everything. I mean, like I said before, I came to a state in my life when I was a lot younger that I was thinking about, what about if this is not true? What about, and then, you know, this idea of, even if the Bible is not inspired, even if the Bible is not reliable, Christianity can still be true because of the resurrection. And to, I mean, it really changed my life. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, brother. I'm glad it's been encouraging. I'll tell you, it's helped me too, because it's like, you know, again, a lot, you know, once you realize Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, and then all these other things, you realize people devote a lot of time to it and attacking one another when everything else, you know, this is an overstatement. It's hyperbolic, but it's like, once you realize Jesus rose from the dead, everything else is secondary.
Yes.
In importance. We know that Christianity is true, and it's just working out some of these other things.
it is, and I like the way that C.S. Lewis has even looked at that. Something like, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun. Through it, you can see everything else. And it does open your eyes to a new perspective on just life and earth, and treating your former, I mean, fellow earth people walking the earth in the same way. So it's really a great thing. So I hope to, so all of us can work together to inspire other people to follow Christianity, because it's truly wonderful. So, well, thank you, everybody. Any final shots before we go? Final words? No, Joel says no. Michael, you're okay.
If you're going to make this a video, SJ, please send me the link, and I'll promote it on my social media channel.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay.
Yes, I am. It's going to be, it's posted right now on YouTube. So it's up and going. So I will send you the link for sure. So
Great.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and shut it down now. Thank you.
Take care.